At the beginning of worship this morning, we're talking about this idea of giving thanks. And it's such a fundamental idea to Wesley and who it is to be, he thought a Methodist would be, that, of course, he included it as one of the marks. Now, if you are noticing, now that we are on week 3 of 5, Wesley, when he talked about the marks of the Methodist, he's talking mostly and almost completely about things that we do, ways that we behave, ways that we think. One of the things that the Methodist movement was not in the beginning, until really doesn't continue to be, is a movement of any particular theology. It wasn't a bold, different claim about Christ or the Holy Spirit, about God, or any of those sorts of things that Wesley really saw as foundational to who it is that we are, even though many of his contemporaries at the day were arguing about those things. Wesley was far more pragmatic than that, which is why I like him so much. Because at the end of the day, he talks a lot about it. At the end of the day, it's a lot about what you do. It's a lot about how you act and behave in the world. It's a lot about what you spend your time thinking about or not thinking about. And what he figured out long ago was giant esoteric arguments about the nature of God or the Trinity was interesting to a handful of people. It was not particularly interesting to the masses. Now, if you would like to have large, interesting, esoteric conversations about the nature of the Trinity, I can make that happen for you. Yeah, all the hands just went up there. I saw that. That's great. All right. That's my Thursday night class. Come on down. We have a lot of fun doing that. But he had a more pragmatic approach. And the truth is, in many ways, Wesley is standing in the same tradition of basically Christian thinkers and Christian teachers all the way back to the beginning. Because if we look at things like the letters of Paul, like we read today, what we read today was one of Paul's letters. Paul's letters are some of the earliest Christian writing that we have. He's only writing a couple of decades after all the things we read about that happened in the Gospels. And he's writing to the early church. And in many ways, he has the same task that Wesley has. He's trying to help this early group of people understand who they are. He wants them to understand who they are and what makes them different from those around them. And while Paul will certainly pepper his letters with some interesting and esoteric comments about the nature of God and all of that, he spends a lot of his time, like he spent in his letters, like he spent today, dealing with far more practical and far more pragmatic subjects. Today, Paul is talking about our need to give thanks. Now, Paul has been on a journey for a long time. Now, if you remember, Paul called himself, he was the Jews' Jew, right? Like he was like the most Jewish guy that there was at the time. And he began his adult ministry actually persecuting the Christians until he had an amazing conversion experience. And then after that, he left. I'm summarizing about 2 decades of history in 30 seconds, mind you. But after that, he eventually leaves and he goes to all of these other places that are not Israel and not Jerusalem to bring this message and this understanding of Christ that he has learned. So he's carrying that all these various places, and one of the places he goes is Corinth, and he helped start a church in Corinth, and he stayed there for a while, and then he moved on to other places and other things, and now he is on his way back. So what 2 Corinthians, the letter we read today, is Paul's letter to the Corinthians that is going to arrive there before he does. And he addresses a lot of subjects in it, big and small. And right here in this section, he is basically giving thanks to the Corinthians. And he's giving thanks both for them in general and their faithfulness in general and how they are in the world in general. But he's also giving thanks for something specific because he's not just going to come back through and say hi, right? He's coming through for a reason. And one of the reasons he's coming through is to gather what they have gathered in their collection. So one of the things that Paul does on his way back from this missionary journey is he goes through all of his churches and he gathers a collection of money, basically, that he is going to take back to Jerusalem. Because while he has been gone in all the other places, there was actually a pretty widespread famine in Jerusalem. And we know this from both Paul, we know this from the Bible, we also know it from historical sources, and historians like Josephus, they write about this large famine that struck Jerusalem about this time. And to the point that people were suffering and people were starving, and outside kingdoms were having to send aid in. So the Egyptians sent aid, and other people sent aid, and other parts of the Roman world were sending aid into Jerusalem because there is a famine that was taking place that was causing a great deal of hardship. Corinth was spared that famine, and in fact, Corinth itself was a fairly wealthy place. So Paul let them know that he was coming through, let them know that he was planning to take up this collection. And what's interesting in this passage is he's giving thanks to them for something they haven't even done yet, right? That's what he's doing here. He's saying, I give thanks for this thing that you are going to do, which is a really amazing way of setting an expectation for people that you kind of hope they're going to live into, right? Well, if he's already giving us thanks for this, I guess we have to do it. I don't know. It's like being told, it's kind of like being finding out you've been volunteered for something when somebody thanks you for doing it, right? Hey, thanks for taking that on. You're like, I didn't know I was volunteered for that, but I guess I'm doing it now. Thank you. I think we've all been there. It's the church after all. We call that voluntold. So Paul is sort of telling them that they need to take up this collection, and he already expects them to be incredibly generous, so he's thanking them for his generosity, and he's going to pick up this money on the way back through. Now that alone makes some sense to us, and we, of course, as a church, we strive to find when there's a need that comes up, we try to find a way to meet that need. I don't know how many times we've taken up collections for various things that are happening in the world, whether it's our fire bucket ministry or our partnership in Angola, or whatever. Like that part we get, right? That's probably not a surprise to us that even early Christians would behave in that way. What adds some interesting detail and a lot of nuance to it is who actually is giving and who's receiving. Because when Paul went out to these various places and decided to go outside the Jewish world to meet people and introduce Christ to them, people who were part of that Jewish world, many of them, including a lot of the leaders at the time, including Peter himself, weren't sure that that was a good idea. And there was a huge debate happening in the church at the time about what people needed to do if they wanted to become part of this thing that they were trying to do. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And the big debate at the time was whether or not you first had to become Jewish before you became Christian. Did you have to do all the Jewish things first, all the stuff that Jesus did, because Jesus did all the Jewish things? Did you have to do that first before you could become a Christian, or could you skip that step? The Gentiles and a lot of Paul's followers were like, no, you don't really have to do that, right? The important thing is that you learn about Christ and you learn to love Christ and you let Christ into your heart and you start behaving like Christ. That's the important thing. The rest of it isn't so important. A lot of the Christ's followers back in Jerusalem begged to differ. And this was an active argument in the life of the church at the time. So those Corinthian Christians, almost all of which were Gentiles, which basically means non-Jewish, would have every right to say, why are we helping those people over there who aren't even sure they want us as part of their club? Why would we gather our resources to send it to them while there are many of them who are trying to actively exclude us? And Paul interjects into all of that conversation. He actually doesn't really ever even address it. Instead, he talks about the fact that there's a need that needs to be filled, and as Christ followers, we are called to fill it, and we are to give thanks for the fact that we have the means to do so. What Paul is saying is what's not important, that part's not important. That's not the important part. What the important part is, you folks, you ones in Corinth have been blessed. You have resources. You have something. You've been spared this famine. We need to give thanks. You need to give thanks for the fact that you have been spared this burden. And one of the ways that you can give thanks for that is to provide for those who haven't. And not only provide for them, but be grateful and joyful that you have the ability to do so. That's Paul's argument in this place. Paul doesn't say, and never does, that the Corinthian church has it all together. They don't. If you read the rest of the letter, you know that there's stuff going on in their church that they're trying to deal with. There's problems there too. They're kind of going through their own stuff. But Paul tries to remind them and reminds them of this important fact that we are called on to remember, is that God is God and God is good, whether we are dealing with good stuff or bad. And we are called to give thanks to God for all that we have when times are good, and we are called to give thanks even when times are bad. Being a Christian and following Jesus doesn't mean that no bad things will happen in our lives. Far from it. What it means is that we know the one and we have a relationship with the one who will help us get through it. Wesley is making the same argument 1,700 years later. When he writes in the original Character of a Methodist, the book that all of this is, his little tract that all of this is based on, little book is based on, the book we are using quotes this quote from Wesley about who it is that Methodists should be. Whether in ease or pain, whether in sickness or health, whether in life or death, he giveth thanks from the ground of his heart to him who orders it for good. Give thanks from the ground of his heart to him that orders it for good, whether it be ease or pain, sickness or health. Wesley himself is not saying that bad things don't happen, far from it. But what he's saying is we serve an amazing and awesome God that is able to make good out of the bad things. And that's one of the biggest challenges I think we face as a Christian. One of the biggest challenges, understanding that we have, is how do we live that out? Because we don't want to dismiss the fact that there are bad things that happen in life. We don't want to dismiss the fact that there are troubles and people are struggling and those struggles are real. We cannot and should not dismiss those. And at the same time, we are called to look for where God is working in those struggles to bring out the good. And that is what we are to be grateful for. That is what we are to give thanks for. Yes, things can always be better. Things in life can always be better. We will still and always be broken people. We will always be living in a broken world. There will always be things that need to work on. And God can make good out of those, and oftentimes God does. And our response to that should be gratitude. Gratitude for the good that God is going to put into the world through us. Even if sometimes it means we have to go through stuff we'd rather not go through. Paul is giving thanks before anything is ever done. He's setting the expectation in the beginning that we ought to be giving thanks for what's going to happen. Paul and Wesley will write later that even after the fact, after we've gone through it, we should give thanks for the good stuff that God has done and the ways in which God got us through. That's the secret to living a faithful life. And it's pretty simple. We look for the good amidst the bad. We concentrate on the good, and we figure out how to make more good and where God is trying to make more good. And we give thanks for the good, while still recognizing that sometimes life is hard. As I was thinking about the story, I was talking with Dane, as I often do. Sometimes I talk to her and I'm like, I'm missing this thing. I'm missing the story. I'm missing the thing. And she's used to me somewhere around Friday to be like, so I've got my sermon mostly done, except I'm just missing the thing, right? There's always, I'm missing the story, the thing that kind of makes this real in life. And I'm like, I know. And I'm thinking, I know we've gone through some stuff. And I'm like, how does this resonate? How does this work? And she reminded me of something important and someone important that I admit, because he's been gone for a little while, is somebody I haven't thought about a lot. And now kind of sad I haven't thought about a lot. And that's my father-in-law. So father-in-laws are generally important people. This is him, this is Dan. Father-in-laws are important people. When you grow up, as I did, with a single mom, father-in-laws become even a little bit more important. Because in my life, and so Dane and I got married in our early 20s. We were still sort of figuring out who in the world we were. There was a lot of growth and stuff that we still had to go through. And for me, the guy in my life who was sort of the guy in my life as I was going through my career discernment and all that sort of stuff became my father-in-law. And he really sort of filled that role in my life. And then when we start to have kids, he was obviously the grandfather that they knew and the grandfather that they had. So Dan played a pretty important role in my life, and at a time when I needed somebody to do that. Dan himself, though you wouldn't know this, and he would very rarely talk about it, went through his own struggles in life and everything that he did. Now, if you talk to Dane, one of the things you'll learn is that she grew up going to something like 9 different schools in 8 different states or something ridiculous. I don't remember what it was. And she will tell people this, and they will automatically assume that she grew up military because that tends to be the way of things with people who grew up military. Unfortunately, she did not grow up military. That's not what's going on. She grew up in retail. And that's where Dan spent most of his career. He spent his career in retail. He started off as like a kind of a department manager at a grocery store, and then an assistant manager, and then eventually got all the way up to a full manager. And of course, it's one of those things where if you want the next promotion to the next thing, you usually have to go to the next store. And if you are from places like we are from, Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, the next store is very far away, right? The next store is not the next town over, or it is the next town over, the next town over is 150 miles, right? So they moved all over the place, when promotions became available, or stores became available, or a better store became available. And when they finally landed in Miles City, it was because they were going to build a brand new store. And so they moved there because Dan was going to get to be part of building a brand new store in the amazing metropolis of Miles City, Montana. Good times. And he did. And that's where I met them. Obviously, that's where I met their daughter, because you always got to meet the new girl when the new girl shows up. We talked about that. Small town life, man. That new girl shows up. You know. All right. And of course, we met. And so he did get to open the store. And that's why he was there. But as time went on, something else sort of happens, as often happens, especially in corporate America. After a while, after you've been around for a while, especially around for several decades, you become, to them, rather expensive. And people start to figure out, as they often do, that newer, younger people would probably work that job for less money than the senior people who've been around for a while. Some of you I know this phenomenon because we've talked about it and because you've lived through it. And it's hard. And businesses, especially big businesses, will oftentimes find ways to exit people in that scenario. And that's what happened to Dan. After working the store and putting all that energy into it and doing all that he could to build this thing up, once it was really about the time it was done and everything was moving along fine, the winds started to change, and there started to be this process to try to exit him out. That was at first a little less obvious, and then became very obvious. Eventually, he did decide to go, and he had a lot of friends in the community at that point, so he found things to do and found ways to entertain himself. And I remember talking to him during this time, because one of his friends was a lawyer. And his lawyer friend was like, you probably have a case here. There's probably something here. They probably didn't do everything the right way. And so they started to work on that, and they started to put everything together and pull all this stuff together, and his friend was very insistent, you probably have a case. And I remember talking to him a few months later, and he's just doing that check-in thing, and I'm like, how's that all going? And he's like, I had to drop it. And I was like, why? It's because I didn't like who I was becoming. I was just getting so mad and so angry all the time that I couldn't do it. And I need to focus on other things. And the other thing he decided to focus on is to find something else to do. He still had some working years left. He still wanted something to do. And what ended up happening was in the next town over, which is about 40 miles, the grand metropolis of Forsyth, Montana, which you've all heard of, there was a guy there that he kind of knew a little bit who owned the local Napa store and had decided that he needed to be done with that. And so Dan, using help from some of his friends, got some money together and he ended up buying this Napa store. One of the things that I knew about my father-in-law, almost from some of my first conversations, is that someday he wanted to own his own store. I'm not sure he even really cared what it was, But he wanted to run his own store where he could run it his way, and he could treat his employees the way that he wanted to treat his employees, and he could treat his customers the way that he wanted to treat his customers. And he could be part of a community the way that he wanted to be part of the community. And so he would commute 40 miles each way to Forsyth, Montana. He wasn't going to move for retail again. That was not going to happen. But he commuted back and forth, bought the store, moved it, bought a building, got some great employees, started to put out donuts and coffee on a regular basis, which meant all the farmers came into town and picked up a few things on their way out. And he got to know people, and he got to love people, and people got to know him, and people got to love him. Eventually, what ends up happening, of course, if you know the story of my father-in-law, is eventually cancer comes. And he held on as long as he could, and then eventually the treatments and everything got to be the point where he wasn't really able to make the commute and do the work anymore. And so he decided to give up the store, and he found somebody he liked who would take care of it. So he decided to sell it to them, and they had to promise to keep on all his employees and keep treating people well and do the things that he needed to do. And so he did that. He let go of the store, and then that following summer, in June, we had his birthday party. We didn't know at the time it was going to be his last birthday party, but it was. We had his birthday party, and all these people came together, including some of the employees from the store, including some of the customers from the store, and the friends and family that were all around him, and his friends from town came together. And it was such an amazing time, because even though he was battling cancer, and I think Dan knew better than we did that the end was probably coming faster than anybody wanted it to, I'm pretty sure he knew what was going on. The only thing that I saw out of him that day was gratitude. All I could tell you I could see is how much he walked around loving and beaming and just so thankful that so many people had come together. That so many people had come together to celebrate his birthday and give him this amazing day. And even at the end, when his time and his health and his energy was failing and it was quite clear, and he slept for about 36 hours after the party was over, that's all I remember of that entire day, was how grateful he was for everything that had gone on, for everyone who had come together. And in many ways, I think he was grateful for the life that he got to live. How he was treated by his store and how all that happened and how corporate America kind of frankly screwed him over is not a good thing. But someone, that person we know as God, made good out of it. To the point that Dan's life still continues to inspire me today, and I keep thinking, and I do think so often, what would it look like here, hopefully somewhere towards maybe like more the middle of my life, to live with as much gratitude as he clearly had at the end? What would it change if on my birthday I was as grateful for the blessings in my life and the people of my life as he was for his last one? That's the power of giving thanks. That's the power of gratitude. And that is what Wesley and Paul are talking about. This is not an overly sentimental, Pollyannish way of looking at life. No, it's a way of looking at life that takes the hard stuff, acknowledges the hard stuff, celebrates the hard work that it takes to get through the hard stuff, and then gives thanks for the getting through it. And it is a life that says, and it's a faith that says, even if there's a hard thing you eventually don't get through, and there was a hard thing he didn't get through, the faith says that good still came out of that, and he is at peace in a place free of pain. Because at the end of the day, God gets the final word. Let us be grateful. Let us give thanks at all times and in all places, when things are hard, when they are easy, or in between. Amen.